Nostalgia is a truly unique human experience. It's a sentimentality for the past, typically for a period or place with happy personal associations. It is often characterized as a longing or desire to return to a former time or place. Let's face it, participating in this great human experience brings with it responsibilities that only seem to pile up as you get older. So, taking a moment to breathe and returning to a place in your mind that brings you peace from time to time can be an extremely therapeutic one. Whether it be a grandparent's house, the smell of your favorite shampoo when you were a kid, or just the longing to return to a time where things were much simpler. Nostalgia can manifest in various shapes for us. But for me, nostalgia manifests itself most prominently in the shape of a cube. Now that takes me back. If that doesn't invoke a sense of nostalgia in you, then you must be one of those lame people who didn't grow up in the 2000s. I was sitting here contemplating what I wanted to do for my next video, and I had a few ideas floating around in my mind. But once I thought about a GameCube nostalgia dump, it was game over, if you will. Yeah, come on, it's okay, it's funny, you can laugh. I wouldn't label this video as a retrospective necessarily, but rather a video navigating my deep love for the GameCube. And if you were someone like me who grew up with this system as their primary console, then hopefully I can evoke a sense of nostalgia in you as well. So buckle up, get your Orville Redenbacher popcorn, and get comfy, because in this video we're going knee-deep in the sea of remembrance to discuss the good, the bad, the ugly, the square Nintendo GameCube. The GameCube was released on November 18th, 2001, alongside a bundle of launch titles, unlike some people we know, that were both accessible to a wide audience of people and extremely replayable. Out of the 12 launch titles that released with the console, the only one that I really got the chance to play as a kid was Luigi's Mansion, which I've discussed before, albeit briefly. Luigi's Mansion was essentially a technology demo that released alongside the GameCube for Nintendo to showcase how advanced the system was. On that level, Luigi's Mansion was extremely successful. The visuals were stunning for their time. The high polygons of the GameCube were something that you really had to see to believe. 3D gameplay never felt so good, especially with its massively improved controller. The Nintendo 64 controller had this large, clunky design. For my child hands, I would have to strain to click the buttons while moving my character around with the joystick. After a few hours, I'd have to set the thing down because my hands would cramp so bad. I guess in some cases, nostalgia has its limits, and I draw my line at physical pain. But by comparison, the GameCube controller offered a much better experience, and to this day, I still argue it's one of the best controllers out there. The joystick and buttons were much easier to reach, and the joystick's octagonal design made for inputs that were butter smooth. Luigi's Mansion allowed the player to experience these improvements firsthand, and had a charm of its own that still garners a cult following to this day. Overall, it's a pretty straightforward 3D action puzzler, but as a kid I couldn't tell the difference. The game has a charmingly spooky atmosphere and a soundtrack that you just couldn't experience on previous consoles. A lot of my earliest memories gaming are playing Luigi's Mansion on school nights and then being embarrassed when I realized I was scared to go into the next room. The game was a huge part of my childhood and had a significant impact on my taste in games for years to come. Speaking of games that were a huge part of my childhood, Super Mario Sunshine was my Super Mario 64, and its design is a perfect reflection of Nintendo's approach to the GameCube. To a little kid who received the GameCube for Christmas in 2002, a little over a year after its initial release, the experience of the console in itself was a truly magical one. The GameCube placed a greater emphasis on the experience of playing video games than its predecessor, the Nintendo 64. The console focused on simple architecture to help speed the development of games by making it easier on software developers. The console was also marketed at $199, which was $100 cheaper than the PlayStation 2 and Xbox. This was a strategic move to get more sales, but to also attract third-party game developers. The guiding design this time wasn't to focus on the console, but rather the games. The console's hardware targeted developers rather than the players so that the best games could be developed. Nintendo mainly showed off the GameCube with the catchphrase of the Nintendo difference, and the design of the GameCube was supposed to be similar to that of a toy. The rotating cube animation that was an iconic introduction to the GameCube and the slogan, "Born to Play," pushed this design concept. The idea was simple. Stronger hardware at a cheaper price meant better games. However, in terms of the market that was game consoles at that time, the Nintendo GameCube was considered a failure. During this time, the market share of the GameCube was much lower than that of its competitors. Nintendo managed to sell 22 million units, but it paled in comparison to consoles like the PlayStation 2, which sold 153 million. And yet, I still remember the experiences of the GameCube far more fondly than its contemporaries. Super Mario Sunshine's reputation has taken a bit of a beating over the years. It's no surprise either. Nintendo's prowess in creating exceptional 3D Mario games has only increased with each iteration, leading to perhaps its strongest entry yet with Super Mario Odyssey. As only the second outing after Super Mario 64, Mario Sunshine represented a franchise that was still, even following its stellar 3D debut, very much finding its feet in the world of 3D gaming, and coupled with a rushed development cycle, it suffered from multiple gameplay frustrations that have only been exacerbated by the passage of time. I have a confession to make though. There will never be another 3D Mario game like Super Mario Sunshine for me. Despite the improvements and overall superior design of later entries, this game will always have an edge in the sense that it was always my comfort game. I still remember cracking open that box on Christmas Day 2002 and getting my first taste of being swept away to a tropical paradise in Isle Delfino. Seeing those warm beaches and sunny streets filled my brain with a shot of endorphins on cold winter nights. I could sit down in front of my TV, pop in the little disc with the shine sprite etched into its front side, and watch the outside world melt away as I stepped onto that sun-drenched airport runway. And here's the real catch. Despite the seemingly perfect circumstances for me loving this game, and being able to ignore its flaws with the gift of childhood innocence at my side, playing Super Mario Sunshine now as a 23-year-old adult with real-world responsibilities looming on my horizon doesn't make me yearn for the past. Instead, I simply get lost in its world as I did 20 years ago, and it still takes me on an adventure that brings a smile to my face every time. That's not all chalked up to nostalgia to me. To me, that's just the sign of a great gaming experience. This is what I mean when I say the GameCube was all about the experience. Nintendo decided to forego all of the gimmicks and technological displays found in other consoles and instead focus on the things people would really remember, their feelings when turning the system on, and their feelings when seeing the console again years down the line and remembering the good times. The adventures the GameCube took me on shaped my unending curiosity and filled me with a sense of wonder for the world that I was still so new to. At that age, I craved to explore it, with my sail set for adventure, ready to leave home and embrace all the challenges that would be laid before me. I wanted, so very badly, to be a hero who would embark on an epic quest to save the world. And no game satisfied that very desire better than The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. I've been beating around the Wind Waker bush for a long time on this channel. Hell, I even made a video poking fun at the criticisms thrown at this game back in the day, which, might I add, threw me for a loop when it was misinterpreted initially. But for any actual flaws or criticisms that could be pointed out about the game other than the childish graphics, it offers me an experience to this day that my inner child can resonate with unlike any other game I've ever played. Wind Waker's iteration of Link is a child seeking adventure. Much like myself at the time. Housed on little boring outside island where nothing ever goes wrong, he craves to be seen as more than just an irresponsible kid who can't seem to get anything right. Both parts clumsy and innocent, heroic and reckless. He throws himself at the opportunity to go on a new adventure to save his sister when she's kidnapped by Ganondorf, leaving his family and friends behind to fulfill his inner desire for adventure and to see the world and all it has to experience. And don't lie to me. None of us were prepared for the adventure Wind Waker would take us on. The Wind Waker had an irresistible charm to it, in large part due to its beautifully cel-shaded aesthetic that still holds a candle to most games to this day. Nintendo opted to give the Zelda series a complete visual overhaul, which would happen time and time again as more games were released, but for a 3D Zelda, fans had never seen anything quite like it up until this point. The aesthetics of the Wind Waker were a sharp contrast to that of Ocarina of Times, and because of that coupled with the Space World 2000 demo that Nintendo put out to showcase what the graphics of the GameCube were capable of, this wasn't the Zelda game fans were anticipating, and many even wrote it off entirely before even playing it. But what do I have to say to those people who dismissed Wind Waker because it looked like a Saturday morning cartoon?
Shame.
Exploring the Great Sea and the King of Red Lions, coupled with the amazing dungeon and boss design, makes exploration equal parts satisfying and addicting. Seeing the silhouette of a new island in the distance and then getting a closer look when it's on the horizon is exciting and makes you want to see all the game has to offer. In many Zelda games that came before and after the Wind Waker, there were signs of age, or frustrating elements to the core gameplay that just aren't present in this one. The Wind Waker has aged like fine wine, and a mixture of the timeless art style, the addicting gameplay, and the memorable and charming characters go a long way to make sure that stays the case. I can't stress enough what the Wind Waker means to me as a journey. The core philosophy behind the Wind Waker is to live for the future, not the past, not the present, but for those who will take up the mantle from us. What can we all do right now in our present circumstances to ensure that the future is secured for everyone who will walk the path we carve for them? Are we capable of stepping outside our comfort zones to explore a wild world full of endless possibilities? Or will we be confined to the paradise of our everyday lives? Paradises are a place of beauty, but those who live in a paradise must be able to let go of it lest it become a prison cell. It is a shame to spend all one's time in a small confined space when there's a great wide world out there, waiting to be experienced. Whenever Link sets out for the Great Sea, the island he just visited shrinks into a tiny speck behind him. The Legend of Zelda theme song begins playing as the wide ocean stretches out in every direction. The little paradise fades away as new shadows appear on the horizon, gradually taking shape as Link sails towards them. A life of adventure awaits those with the courage to step beyond their comfort zones. And for me, the Wind Waker will always represent my inner child, excitedly waiting to spread his wings and dive headfirst into that world for those adventures he craved so deeply, ready to be taken on a journey that would reshape my view of the world. In many ways, the Wind Waker exemplified the very philosophy behind the Nintendo GameCube as well. In 10 years, what will people truly remember about a console? Will people really remember how powerful the PS5 was or the speed of its processor? Or will they instead remember the journeys and experiences the console built a bridge to take them on? Nintendo got it right with the GameCube, in every aspect. There were no flashy menu screens or GUIs that took your attention away from the games, and there were no interruptions during play that caused a distraction from your experience. The GameCube's main menu screen is a perfect example of this. You'd think the image of a cube floating in a dark void with nothing but ambient music in the background would be ominous, but the menu instead presents itself by asking you a simple question: what do you want to play? The system willingly takes a back seat to the games, not the other way around. The GameCube was the product of a time I so dearly miss in gaming. There was no popping in a disc and then waiting for a day one patch to download. For a game to finally be released, it had to be finished on day one, lest any bugs would become a part of that game's legacy for all time and put a serious stain on companies' reputations. And every time I replay the Wind Waker, I'm transported back to the first time I ever played the game. I remember how the game sparked my childhood wonder and imagination and nudged me to ponder the possibilities of the world around me. And while the Wind Waker made me want to set my sails for new adventures, there's another game from my childhood that I played shortly thereafter that made me want to blast off on my very own rocket ship and explore the mysteries of the entire universe. When someone mentions Nintendo, the first thing that comes to mind is Super Mario. And the other games? Well, let's just say some of them have lasted longer than the F-Zero and Kid Icarus franchises. Pikmin is one of the hidden gems of Nintendo and has been around for a long time now. It has seen a few sequels and even some spin-offs for other consoles. It's a franchise that I absolutely adore and one that is severely underrated. When I think about Pikmin on the GameCube, the first thing associated with it is Eagle Video. Now, if you live in the Midwest East Coast area, this image will definitely ring a bell, as it was a staple at Giant Eagle in the early 2000s. My first experience with Pikmin was bringing it home from Eagle Video and then not getting very far before returning the game a few days early because of its stress-inducing design. If you're familiar with the first game in the series, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. You're dropped into a foreign planet as Captain Olimar after crash landing your spaceship, and you have 30 days to recover your spaceship's lost parts before running out of oxygen and perishing all alone on an alien planet where nobody can hear you scream. Pikmin was the first game that truly challenged my problem-solving abilities and turned me loose in an intimidating world that asked me to figure it out for myself. I'll be fair to myself back then though, as a few years later I picked up the game again and gave it another chance, and I was absolutely captivated by its world and adventure that it took me on. Pikmin has an incredible atmosphere that makes you both feel small and vulnerable in an unknown world, and because of its setting, the game is able to keep you on your toes, as you never know what could be lurking around the next corner, ready to chow down on your little body. The star of the show here are the little Pikmin that sprout from the ground and await your every command. You can throw your Pikmin to gather resources and fight for you, and I would always feel a lump in the back of my throat every time I set one of them to their untimely demise at the hands of an enemy or the environment around us. The 30-day counter in the original Pikmin was a tool similar to that of Majora's Mask in the sense that it was there to create further challenge for the player and test their time management abilities. Because there were 27 more days in Pikmin's race against the clock, however, the time of each day is reduced to only 13 real-world minutes from a few hours in comparison to Majora's Mask. This means from the very beginning, players will have to make a conscious effort to use their time wisely, as some days can be cut short by running out of health or getting stuck and not knowing where to go next. The game further stresses the importance of time management in its UI design. The clock is always displayed at the bottom of the screen and takes up a large portion of the HUD. Players can pace themselves knowing they're on track to complete the game with a good ending so long as they gather at least one part per day. Days can also be replayed so as long as the player hasn't advanced to the following day. So there's some leniency to the system if you're willing to sacrifice up to 13 minutes of progress in exchange for a more efficient redo of a day. More than just a great game, Pikmin 1 was also another remarkable showcase for the hardware and controller of the Nintendo GameCube, and was a unique experience compared to other real-time strategy games on the market. The charm of the Pikmin planet and the little creatures themselves have inspired 2 sequels and a love for this franchise that has been burning in me for years. Pikmin tested my problem-solving abilities for the first time as a gamer, and even gave me the confidence to pick up and finish Majora's Mask for the first time too, so bonus points in that department. As the years slip away, I look back on a franchise like Pikmin and crave the challenge it provided me as a kid, as well as the reward for completing my task, knowing that I led Captain Olimar off the planet safely in his race against the clock. The pure adrenaline I got from this very sprint to the finish line is one I will hold with me for the rest of my life, and was an adrenaline that I would be able to recapture once again with the release of this next game.
Sigma Alpha 2 heading due south over the city. We're en route. Everything's a go.
This is Control Tower. We have you on radar. Report cargo status of captured Hedgehog aboard. Over.
That's a 10-4. Cargo secured on board and... What? The
Didn't copy
Hedgehog
that.
is
Over.
gone. He's taken out everyone aboard and...
What's
What
wrong?
in the
Come
world?
in. Over.
Freeze! What do you think you're doing? Get that Hedgehog!
Talk about low-budget flights, no food or movies. I'm out of here. I like running better.
I'm gonna say it. Sonic Adventure 2 is the best 3D Sonic game, period. I poured hundreds upon hundreds of hours into this when I first picked it up for the GameCube, and the levels and soundtrack from the game still ring so loudly in my brain over 20 years later. Not only was Sonic Adventure 2 the first appearance of Shadow in the franchise, but it was the game that made me fall in love with Sonic. It set the bar for me in what I thought a 3D Sonic game should be, so it was really unfortunate for me in the decades that followed. Sonic Adventure 2 might also be the most important Sonic game in the history of the franchise. Sonic defined Sega as a company, and it's what propelled the Sega Genesis to stardom. I will die on the hill that the Sega Saturn suffered because of the lack of a new mainline Sonic game for the system following the Genesis. Then Sonic Adventure brought Sonic back in a big way as the best-selling game on the Dreamcast, but with everything that happened in the Dreamcast department and Sega effectively exiting the hardware business, where could Sonic go without a console of his own to call home? Sonic Adventure 2 wasn't just important because it was a port of a Dreamcast game on Nintendo hardware, which in itself would have been enough to shock anyone familiar with that time period, but it was proof that Sonic was a franchise that could transcend its fame on Sega platforms and be successful in a larger scope of the industry. The scenario was really a win-win for both Nintendo and Sega, as the two companies had effectively buried the hatchet with a decade's worth of adversity behind them. Nintendo got a new third-party developer with an already passionate fan base to develop for GameCube, which was lagging behind the PS2 at the time, while Sega got a new platform to release its games on that agreed with a lot of its design philosophies. Just consider how well Sonic Adventure 2 performed in the GameCube compared to its original release. The game sold about 500,000 units on the Dreamcast, which is nothing to scoff at, but over its lifetime after releasing on the GameCube sold upwards of 1.7 million copies worldwide. Sonic's introduction to new hardware also allowed for a new generation to discover the fastest thing alive for themselves. To kids who had never owned a Sega console, or just the Dreamcast in my case, they saw a game that magazines and media were pushing hard. I remember back then having a subscription to Nintendo Power and seeing an old issue on sale at my local GameStop with Sonic draped all over the cover promoting the game. That newfound bond between Sega and Nintendo remained Sega's best decision since exiting the hardware business, and may very well be the decision that kept them in the business altogether. Furthermore, I just want to personally thank Sega for introducing a young kid to the Sonic franchise and for developing this game for the GameCube following their untimely exit from the console business. Sonic Adventure 2 was a huge hit between my friends and I growing up, and we would go as far as to theorize on what the next game in the franchise would be like when we finished the story. The game had insane replay value, with being able to select any stage to play again upon completing it and trying to get an A rank on every mission. Sonic and Shadow stages were fast-paced platformers that featured music that slapped hard enough to give you whiplash. Tails and Eggman stages featured slower gameplay that were tad frustrating at times but brought something unique to the table. Knuckles and Rouge stages had players on a hide-and-seek mission to find pieces of the Chaos Emeralds scattered throughout the level, and the locations of the pieces were randomized for each playthrough. While this design did make for a variety of gameplay when binge-rushing the story, I couldn't help but feel like I was only getting through those stages to get to the next Sonic and Shadow level. And let's be honest with ourselves. The only reason I was waiting to get back to the Sonic and Shadow levels was to ultimately gather these little animals throughout the stages and get back to the only reason that this is considered the best 3D Sonic game. the Chow Garden. I think of all the time I've put into Sonic Adventure 2, at least 3/4 of that was solely dedicated to the Chow Garden. To this day, it boggles my mind as to why Sega will not bring this back in modern Sonic games. And fight me on this, the sins of Sonic 06 would have been forgiven had it included the Chow Garden. Okay, I said it. Bring on the pitchforks. The Chow Garden in Sonic Adventure 2 was, you guessed it, a place for you to raise your very own chows. They start off in these little eggs, and with enough rocking the baby, they finally hatch. Raising these little chows with different characters was something I could never get tired of as a kid. I remember my best friend's mom at the time was in college, and we would go with her to the computer lab just so we could search how to get the rarer breeds of chow, and then spend the entire night trying to get them. My best friend and I would hold monthly chow tournaments too, where we'd raise a chow from scratch on the same save file and then pit them against each other to see who would emerge victorious like some 300 shit. I could go on and on about the Chow Garden, but unfortunately this is a bad video that doesn't feature the Chow Garden as its main focus, so I'll save the rest of my thoughts for another time. Sonic Adventure 2. What a special game that brings back so many fond memories. What an introduction to an iconic franchise for a little kid. It's somewhat fitting that I wouldn't have a flashy transition for a game about darkness and twilight. The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess was by no means the last game that was released for the GameCube, but it certainly came as the console was approaching its own Twilight. And because Zelda is something I've never talked about on this channel before, I figured...
Not again.
Oh.
Find something else to talk about, you
Alright then. What can I say? I must like these Zelda games or something. As I discussed previously, The Wind Waker was really my first Zelda game I got to experience, and the journey meant more to my childhood than I think I could put into words. However, The Wind Waker's graphics were branded with a childish label back then, and its sales suffered as a result. What Zelda fans really wanted was a game that resembled something closer to a true Ocarina of Time sequel, and on that front, Twilight Princess succeeded while carving out an identity of its own completely free of its predecessors. If The Wind Waker spoke to my inner child dealing with the coming-of-age story and wanting to satisfy my curiosity for the world, then Twilight Princess was a game that spoke to me much later in my life. At its core, Twilight Princess operates in a more mature lane, tackling themes such as isolation and responsibility, what someone is willing to do to save the people they love, and accepting a great responsibility thrust upon them without hesitation. Twilight Princess was the last mainline Zelda game the GameCube would receive, and it was the GameCube's final gift to a young wacko that he would come to appreciate years down the line. Twilight Princess was the massive cherry on top of the GameCube's already impressive library of games, and I honestly don't think there was a better way to unofficially put the stamp on the GameCube than with a grandiose adventure quite like this one. I'm going to reserve a lot of my thoughts on Twilight Princess for a video in the future, but as I get older, its message has only grown to resonate with me more and more. Compared to other Zelda games from that era, Twilight Princess was significantly longer and more grand than the other games in the series. It took me almost 50 hours to beat the game on my first playthrough, and while I was just a kid back then with a questionable sense of memory and direction, when I played through the game again on the Wii U, it took me nearly 40 hours. This game pulls no punches when promising to deliver on its intense and masterfully crafted dungeons and overworld. As the story progresses, the stakes only get higher as the land of Hyrule gets more dangerous for Link. The characters each have a charming personality that makes the player care for them, and in some cases are so well written that the emotional moments really land beautifully. The pacing in the first half of the game draws criticisms for some, but I appreciate that the game takes its time to set up the characters and world building, as it makes for a satisfying payoff in later sequences. And I have to say it, Midna is the best character in all of Zelda. I haven't felt a stress for a character like during the Midna's final hour sequence. Coupling that with the intense and emotional piano soundtrack playing as you rush her to Zelda makes for one of the most heart-wrenching moments in all of gaming. The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess's impact on me wasn't felt until much later on in my life, but the nostalgia for the GameCube I get while playing it is still an intense one. The game exuded a maturity and responsibility that I haven't quite felt from a Zelda game since, and it remains one of my fondest memories of gaming to this day. In this instance, nostalgia hits hard once again. In the final section of this video, I just want to touch on a few things. This video has only been a small glimpse into some of my fondest memories with the GameCube, as this console defined my gaming experience in my adolescent years. Even with the release of the Nintendo Wii in 2006, I still found myself popping in the GameCube discs more than the actual Wii games. I still remember plugging in those Donkey Kong bongos to use with the Donkey Konga games and spraining my wrist from playing Donkey Kong Jungle Beat. I still remember accidentally leaving the console on overnight and unlocking Mewtwo in Super Smash Bros. Melee, or the times playing the Mario Party games with friends for sleepovers. The GameCube not only influenced my taste in video games for my entire life, but it also introduced me to the medium and fostered my love for the industry in a way that no other game system could have. We're the lucky ones, you know? We got to experience a time in the game industry where playing a video game was a pure experience. There were no distractions from modern industry tidings or day one updates to cover up for unfinished products. The only thing separating you from playing your favorite games was one push of a button, and untangling the mess of cables that came with having several GameCube controllers plugged in at once and friends who didn't care about cable management. To chalk all of my feelings towards the GameCube up to nostalgia would be selling the system short, because many of its exclusives have aged beautifully. Ultimately, people don't remember getting a console because it just looked cool. They remember the fun they had, and the people they experienced that fun with. The GameCube was a console that put the fun and experience of gaming above all else, and that's why people will never forget it, and why it still managed to find new fans every single day. With the release of emulators like Dolphin, it's never been easier to relive your childhood experiences all over again, as long as you still have a physical copy of all your games on hand, of course. Years down the line, as hardware only ages further and eventually becomes obsolete, emulation will be the only thing we have left for game preservation, so I'm incredibly grateful to those developers who have made it their mission to keep these games preserved and accessible to all future generations who may wish to experience what we did firsthand. I know I'll never forget the Nintendo GameCube and the memories it gave me throughout my childhood, just like millions of others who share the same feelings I do. And if you ask me, that's not a bad legacy to have at all. So if I had to wrap up this video with one final parting to the system, there's only one thing that makes sense. Thank you for the memories.